My husband and my sister thought I was a painting. Something beautiful to hang on the wall and look at. They never once stopped to ask who actually owned a frame. That is the thought I kept coming back to during the 11 months it took me to destroy them. Not out of anger, though I had plenty of that in the beginning. By the end it was not anger anymore. It was arithmetic. It was patience. It was the particular, unglamorous work of a woman who has decided that the quietest room in the house is the most dangerous one to be underestimated in. I have thought a great deal, in the 2 years since, about why so few people saw it coming, including, for a long time, me. I think the answer is simpler and sadder than anyone wants it to be. People do not expect the quiet, composed woman in the corner of the room to be the one holding all the actual power, and they especially do not expect her to be capable of using it against the very people she loves most. Because we have all, collectively, decided that love and ruthlessness cannot occupy the same person at the same time. I am here to tell you they can. I loved my husband. I raised my sister. And I still, when the moment came, did not hesitate for even a single second to make sure the truth about both of them became permanent, public, and unerasable. My name is Clara Whitfield. I am 35 years old. For 11 years I was, by every outward measure, the luckiest woman in a certain zip code of Manhattan. Married to Richard Whitfield, the charismatic face of Whitfield Fine Art. One of the most respected authentication and gallery houses on the Upper East Side. Sister to Chloe, 27, beautiful, warm, the kind of young woman people described as a breath of fresh air. I had a townhouse. I had a driver. I had a husband who photographed well at galas, and a sister I had raised more than half raised. Really, since our parents died when she was 19. What almost none of them knew, because Richard had spent a decade making sure almost none of them knew, was that I was the IA. I was the one who could stand in front of a canvas for 4 minutes and tell you, with a certainty that had never once been wrong in 17 years, whether it was real. Richard had the charm. Richard had the handshake and the table at the right restaurant. I had the thing underneath all of it that actually kept the lights on. He liked it that way. He liked being the face. He told people I preferred to stay out of the spotlight, and for a long time I told myself that was true, because it was easier than admitting he needed me small. I want to tell you up front how this ends, the way I told myself the ending on the nights it was hardest to keep going. It ends with federal agents walking into the largest auction of the year. It ends with my husband and my sister in handcuffs in front of 300 of the people they had spent a decade trying to impress. It ends with a foundation in Switzerland that neither of them can touch, holding a collection worth more than either of them will make in the rest of their lives, with my name on the deed and nobody else's. But it starts with a hotel receipt, in a jacket pocket, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, in a walk-in closet, in a townhouse, on 73rd Street. My father's name was Edmund Whitfield, and before he was Richard's father-in-law, he was mine. And before he was anyone's father-in-law, he was the reason I know what I know. He started as a framer's apprentice in a small shop off Madison Avenue, at 19 years old, with no money and no name in this city. And he built, over 40 years, one of the most quietly respected private collections in the Northeast. Not through inheritance, and not through luck, but through an eye that almost nobody in this business is actually born with. He taught it to me the way some fathers teach a trade, patiently, on Saturday mornings, standing me in front of paintings in museum galleries, and asking me to tell him what I saw before he told me what I was looking at. My mother died when I was 22, a car accident on the Merritt Parkway, on a rainy October night, and my father did not remarry, and did not, as far as I ever knew, seriously try. He poured what was left of himself into 2 things, me, and the collection. By the time I was 28, I could authenticate a disputed canvas faster, and more reliably, than men who had spent their entire careers doing nothing else. And my father knew it, and it was the proudest thing he ever said to me, quietly, the week before he died of a heart attack in his study at 68. He said, "Clara, you have the eye I always wanted, and never quite had." He said, "Protect it." He said, "And protect what it's worth, because people will always try to borrow it without paying for it." I did not understand, at 29, standing at his funeral, how literally I would one day need to take that instruction. He left the collection to me outright, and he left, buried in the paperwork of his estate, a private Swiss foundation that almost nobody knew existed, structured so that it could only ever be controlled by a Whitfield, by blood, accessible by signature, and by a biometric key tied to his own bloodline, which meant, in practice, that it could only ever be controlled by me. At the time I thought it was simply a tax structure, one more piece of the careful architecture my father had built around everything he loved. I did not understand, for a long time, that he had also built me an escape hatch. I do not think even he fully understood what he was protecting me from. I think he simply understood, in the way careful men sometimes do, that the world does not reliably protect women who are quietly brilliant and married to men who are loudly charming. And he wanted to make sure that if it ever came to it, I would have somewhere no one else could follow me. I met Richard Whitfield, though he was not a Whitfield yet, at a benefit auction this spring after my father died. He was 30, and I was 24, and he was, by every conventional measure, extraordinary. Tall, easy in a room the way almost no one in the art world naturally is. Funny in the specific way that made people feel clever for laughing. He did not know a Rembrandt from a very good student copy, not really, not the way I did, but he knew how to talk about paintings, so that wealthy people wanted to be near him while he did it. And in this business, I would come to understand that particular skill is worth almost as much as mine, and considerably easier to sell to strangers at a gala. He courted me the way he did everything, thoroughly and beautifully. He learned enough about authentication to ask me real questions instead of flattering ones. He remembered the names of paintings I mentioned once in passing. He was, for 2 years, genuinely wonderful to be near, and I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to the rest of the story. I did not marry a monster. I married a man who, slowly, over a decade, discovered that being married to a genuinely brilliant woman is a very different experience from being seen as one, and who never quite forgave me for the difference. We took my father's name for the gallery when we married, Whitfield Fine Art, because the name already carried 40 years of my father's reputation, and because Richard, to his credit, in that one specific decision, understood that the name was worth more than his own. What he did not say out loud, not then, was that he intended, over time, to make the name mean him instead of me. He became the one photographed at openings. He became the one quoted in the trade press. I became, by his careful design and my own tiredness, the woman standing slightly behind him in every photograph. The one people described, when they described me at all, as Richard Whitfield's lovely, private wife. I let it happen because the alternative, the fighting for credit, the correcting people at parties, felt exhausting and faintly undignified, and because I told myself it did not matter who got the credit, as long as the work was done right. I understand now that this was Richard's first successful theft. He did not steal money first. He stole my visibility, slowly enough that I helped him do it, and I think that early success is what convinced him, years later, that stealing everything else would be just as easy. I think it would be too simple, and not entirely honest. To tell this story as though there were 11 years of nothing, and then 11 months of quiet warfare. There were good years in between, real ones, and I want to name a few of them, because I think leaving them out would flatten Richard into a caricature he does not deserve. Even now, even after everything, and because I think understanding the good years is the only way to understand how completely I was capable of missing what came later. There was a spring, 4 years into the marriage, when Richard flew to Basel with me for an authentication trip I had expected to take alone, simply to carry my bags and sit through 6 hours of tedious provenance meetings, so that I would not have to eat dinner by myself in a hotel restaurant every night for a week. There was a winter, 6 years in, when my father's old business partner tried, after his death, to quietly claim a disputed stake in part of the collection, and Richard, whatever his later failings, fought that claim on my behalf, with a genuine, unglamorous doggedness, for 4 months until it was resolved entirely in my favor. There was a night, 7 years in, when I lost a bid on a piece I had wanted for the gallery for over a year. A minor disappointment in the scheme of things, but one that had quietly devastated me. And Richard found me crying in the bathroom of a restaurant and did not try to fix it or minimize it. He simply sat down on the tile floor next to me in his good suit, and stayed there until I was ready to stand up. I tell you this not to soften what he did later, because nothing softens it, but because I think grief for what a marriage actually was is a different, more complicated thing than grief for what you wish it had been. And I have had to hold both of those truths at once for 2 years now. I loved a man who was, for a real stretch of years, genuinely capable of sitting on a bathroom floor, in a good suit for someone else's sake. That man, and the man who spent a year quietly building a case for my incompetence, were, somehow, the same person, and I do not fully understand how one became the other. Only that it happened slowly enough that I did not see the turn until I was already living on the other side of it. My sister Chloe is 8 years younger than I am, and our parents died when she was 19, and I was 27, which meant I became something closer to a mother than a sister, in the years that followed. Whether either of us had chosen that or not. I paid for the rest of her college. I sat with her through 2 bad breakups, and 1 very bad year that I still do not fully discuss. I brought her into the gallery when she graduated because she was smart and personable, and I genuinely believed, at the time, that giving her a real career inside something our father built was the truest way I had left to keep him present in her life. I do not know exactly when her gratitude curdled into something else. I have turned it over many times since, in the quiet of the Geneva office, and I think it happened slowly, the way most resentments do. I think being the sister of the I, rather than the I herself, wore on her in ways she never once said out loud to me. And I think Richard, who had spent a decade learning exactly how that particular wound felt from the inside, recognized it in her before I ever did, and knew precisely how to use it. I do not say this to excuse either of them. I say it because I think the truest, saddest engine of what happened in my house was not simple lust or simple greed. It was to people who each, in their own way, felt smaller standing next to me, finding each other, and discovering that the fastest way to feel large again was to make me disappear. Richard did not travel that week. That is the detail that undid everything, and it undid it so quietly that I almost missed it. I was hanging his jacket, a small domestic task I did not think twice about, the kind of task a marriage runs on without either person noticing. A receipt fell out of the inside pocket. The Carlisle. A Tuesday afternoon. A rate for 2 people that made it obvious the room had not been used for a nap. I did not confront him. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. It was not fear, not exactly. It was that 17 years of studying paintings had trained a very specific instinct into me. And the instinct said, do not react to the first piece of evidence. The first piece of evidence tells you almost nothing on its own. It only tells you where to look next. So I looked next. Quietly, over 3 weeks. The way I had once traced a disputed provenance back through 4 countries and 60 years of ownership records without anyone at the auction house realizing I was doing it. I checked calendars against alibis. I noted which Tuesdays Chloe had client dinners that no client could later confirm. I watched the 2 of them in rooms together, and I saw what I had been too generous, or too tired, or too in love with the idea of my family to see before. The way Richard's hand found the small of her back for half a second too long, when he thought I was across the room. The way Chloe stopped meeting my eyes at family dinners, and started watching Richard's face, instead, waiting for his reactions before she offered her own. It had been going on, I eventually pieced together, for nearly 8 months, my husband and my baby sister. In my own house, more than once, while I was at a symposium in Basel, authenticating a Flemish altarpiece for a client who trusted my judgment more than my own family apparently did. That was the wound. I will not pretend it was not a wound. But it was not, it turned out, even the worst thing they were doing to me. The second thing took longer to find, and it frightened me more, because the first thing was a betrayal of the heart and the second thing was a plan for my body and my mind. I started noticing gaps. Small ones at first. I would walk into a meeting and lose the thread of a sentence I had rehearsed an hour before. I would misplace things that I never misplaced. Keys, a phone. A folder of conditioned reports I had reviewed myself the night before. I am a precise person. Precision is the entire foundation of what I do for a living. Precision failing me, repeatedly, in front of colleagues and clients, was not like me, and some old surviving instinct in me refused to accept that it was simply stress. I began keeping my evening tea in a different cup, a small private test, and switching it without telling anyone. The fog did not follow the tea. It followed something else. It took me longer than I am proud of to think to have my own prescriptions independently tested. Quietly, through a pharmacist 2 boroughs away, who did not know my name meant anything in this city. What came back explained the missing threads, the lost folders, the mornings I woke already exhausted. My dosage had been adjusted. Not by my doctor. I sat with that fact for 2 days before I let myself understand what it meant. Chloe had a key to my medicine cabinet, the way sisters do. The way I had given it to her without a second thought. Because I loved her, and had raised her, and had never once imagined I needed a door I could lock against her. And once I understood what was happening to my body, the rest of it arranged itself into a shape I could finally see whole. Richard had begun. gently, in front of exactly the right people, describing me as fragile, exhausted, not quite herself lately. Poor thing. Since the Basel trip, I think the pressure finally caught up with her. He said it to our attorney. He said it to 2 board members. He said it with his hand resting protectively on my shoulder, and every person in the room believed him. Because why would a devoted husband lie about something like that? The isolation, once I understood the plan, showed up in retrospect as a series of small, deliberate moves I had lived through without naming. Richard had spent the previous year quietly encouraging me to step back from board meetings, framing it each time as concern for my well-being, telling me he would handle this one so I could rest. He had begun handling the gallery's correspondence with our longtime accountant directly, cutting me out of a loop I had been inside for a decade, always with a plausible, caring explanation attached. He had started scheduling my calendar himself, through his assistant, so that fewer and fewer of my own appointments were entirely within my own control. None of it, on any single day, looked like anything other than a devoted husband lightening his wife's load. Together, over a year, it looked like a woman being quietly walled off from every lever of authority she had ever held, by a man everyone in the room believed was protecting her. Chloe's role in it was smaller, but crueler in its own way, because it required a performance of love. She began, in that same year, positioning herself as my closest confidant, the person I supposedly turned to when I was overwhelmed, which meant that when board members later heard secondhand accounts of my anxious, forgetful behavior, the accounts were coming from my own sister. A source no one in that room would think to question. I did not know, until Walter helped me later reconstruct the timeline from email records and calendar logs. Just how many separate conversations Chloe had quietly had with gallery staff. Framed always as worry, always as love. Each one another brick in a wall, being built around me by the 2 people I trusted most in the world. They were building a file on my instability, while manufacturing the instability themselves. The plan, once I traced every thread of it, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Declare me incompetent. Take guardianship of my share of the gallery through Richard. With Chloe's testimony as the loving, worried sister backing him up. Move me somewhere quiet, and well-appointed and very far from anything I could sign my name to. And live, the 2 of them, on the empire I had actually built with my eye and my reputation. The empire Richard had only ever fronted. I did not scream. I want you to understand that, because I think it is the part of this story that people find hardest to believe. I did not confront them in the kitchen at midnight. I made dinner that Thursday. I asked Richard about his day. I let Chloe borrow the blue dress she has always loved. The one I wore to our parents' anniversary, the year before they died. And I told her it suited her, and I meant it. Because loving someone and knowing exactly what they are trying to do to you or not, it turns out, mutually exclusive states. They are simply both true at once. And I decided that the only sane response to that was to let them believe their performance was working while I built mine underneath it. For 11 months, I played the part they had already written for me. The fragile wife. The slightly forgetful one. I let small, harmless errors show up at gallery meetings. Deliberately, the kind that made board members exchange glances, and made Richard's hand find my shoulder again, in that same performed, sympathetic way. I smiled at Chloe across the dinner table. I told Richard he looked tired, and asked if he wanted to talk about it. Every night I set down the character, and every night, in a room they never once thought to search, I picked up the actual work. The actual work had 3 parts, and each one took months, and none of them could be rushed, because rushing is how careful people get caught. I kept a ledger for it, though I never called it that in my own head at the time. A private notebook, kept in a safe deposit box under my maiden name, at a bank neither Richard nor Chloe knew I still used. Every Tuesday night, after Richard had gone to bed, believing his wife had taken an early sedative for her nerves, I sat in a small office 2 blocks from the townhouse that I had quietly leased in cash under a shell name. My father's Geneva attorney had helped me set up years earlier for exactly this kind of discretion, and I worked. I want people to understand what that discipline actually looked like. Because I think the version of this story people imagine is a woman having one dramatic epiphany, and then simply winning. That is not what it was. It was hundreds of small, unglamorous hours. It was cross-referencing, shipping manifests against gallery sale records at 1 in the morning. It was learning, from scratch, how offshore banking structures work. Because I needed to understand exactly how Richard was moving money, before I could prove it. It was becoming, in 11 months. Something between a forensic accountant and a private investigator. Entirely self-taught, entirely alone, because the moment I brought in anyone I could not absolutely trust. The moment word reached Richard that his wife was asking unusual questions, everything I was building would collapse before it was finished. The first part was Richard's ego, which turned out to be the crack the entire structure had been built on top of. For years, I now understood, he had been quietly selling work to a certain kind of client. Wealthy, private, more interested in owning a famous name than in the tedious matter of provenance, and telling them pieces were authenticated originals, when they were, in fact, extraordinarily high-quality reproductions he had commissioned himself. He had done it without my knowledge, or my sign-off, riding on the reputation my authentications had built for the gallery over 17 years. Because he knew no one would ever think to question the Whitfield name, I spent months tracing every one of those sales, cross-referencing, shipping records, restoration invoices, and the private ledgers he thought only he had access to, until I had a complete, quiet, documented map of exactly what he had sold, to whom, and for how much. The second part was the collection itself. Beneath the gallery, in climate-controlled storage that almost no one had clearance to enter, sat the real collection, the pieces my father had spent 40 years acquiring before he died. Pieces that were, on paper, jointly held under the gallery's corporate structure, which meant that on paper, Richard had a claim to them. I spent 3 months working with a discreet estate attorney in Geneva to move that collection, piece by piece, legally, quietly, into a private Swiss foundation my father had actually established decades earlier, and that I was the sole living trustee of, accessible only by my signature and a biometric verification only I could provide. By the time I was finished, the paintings that mattered, the real ones, were somewhere neither Richard nor Chloe would ever be able to reach, no matter what a guardianship judge eventually decided about my competence. The third part was the storeroom they thought they controlled. I let it fill, quietly, over those same months, with the reproductions Richard had commissioned, the ones he had been secretly selling as originals. I did not remove them. I did not confront him about them. I simply let them accumulate exactly where his own greed had put them. In the space that was about to become the centerpiece of the biggest auction of his career. I want to describe, as precisely as I can, what it actually costs to live inside a lie of that size for 11 months, because I think people imagine it as a kind of cold, satisfying secret mission, and some days it was that, but most days it was simply exhausting in a way I had not known a body could sustain. I still made Richard's coffee the way he liked it, every morning. Slightly too strong, no sugar, because changing that small, ordinary habit would have been its own kind of confession. I still asked about his day at dinner, and listened to his answers, most of which I now understood to be partial or invented. And I still laughed at the jokes that were actually funny, because he was, even then, still sometimes funny, and grief and clarity, and even a strange residual fondness, were all, somehow, occupying the same body at once. I went to Chloe's birthday dinner in September, 5 months into the quiet work, and I gave her a bracelet that had been our mother's. And I meant the sentiment behind the gift even as I understood, with total clarity, what she was doing to me in the other rooms of my life. People who have not lived through a betrayal like this sometimes assume love simply stops the moment you learn the truth. It does not stop. It just stops being the only true thing in the room. The physical toll was its own separate weight. I lost 11 pounds that year without trying to. I stopped sleeping through the night sometime around month 4, and did not really sleep through one again until after the arrests. I developed a habit, which Walter eventually gently pointed out to me, of touching the corner of my wedding ring during meetings. An unconscious tell I had to train myself out of before the auction. Because a woman who is about to end her husband's career cannot afford a single visible crack in the 11 months of composure she has spent building. What kept me upright, more than anything else, was the ledger itself. Every Tuesday night, watching the case grow more solid, more provable, more undeniable, gave me something that felt, some weeks, like the only stable ground in my entire life. My father had taught me that a painting either holds up under close examination, or it does not, and there is a strange, steadying comfort in devoting yourself, night after night, to building something that you know, with total certainty, will hold up. I did not do all of it entirely alone, and I think it would be dishonest to let you believe I did. There was one person, a man named Walter Osei, who had been my father's attorney for 30 years, before he became mine, who I finally called on a Sunday morning in the 7th month, sitting in my leased office with the ledger open in front of me, and my hands, for the first time in months, actually shaking. Walter had known me since I was a teenager, standing behind my father at estate closings, bored and restless, and unaware I was absorbing an entire education by osmosis. He listened to me for 2 hours without interrupting once, which is, I have come to learn, an exceedingly rare quality in attorneys, and in men generally. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked me a single question. He asked whether I wanted revenge, or whether I wanted the truth on the record, because he said, in his experience, people who confuse the two often end up with neither. I told him I wanted the truth on the record, and if the record happened to be devastating to the two people who had put it there, I did not consider that revenge. I considered it accuracy. Walter became, from that morning forward, the only other person who knew the full shape of what I was building. He was the one who structured the Geneva transfer, so that it would be airtight against any future guardianship claim. He was the one who taught me, patiently, over a series of Sunday mornings, that came to feel like my father's old Saturday lessons in front of museum canvases, how a federal fraud case actually gets built, what a prosecutor needs to see before a grand jury will indict, what kind of documentation survives cross-examination, and what kind gets torn apart in an afternoon. He told me once, near the end, that in 30 years of practicing law, he had never seen a client build a case against her own husband, with this much patience, and this little malice, showing on the surface. And he said it the way my father used to say things, as though it were simply an observation of fact, rather than a compliment I was meant to enjoy. It was Walter who suggested, in the 9th month, that I begin quietly interviewing a handful of the collectors Richard had sold reproductions to, under the pretense of routine authentication follow-up calls that were, in fact, entirely normal for a gallery to make. 3 of the 7 collectors I reached had begun, independently, to suspect something was wrong with pieces they had purchased, and were, once I gently confirmed their suspicions were correct, more than willing to provide sworn statements when the time came. That detail mattered more than almost anything else in the eventual case, because it meant the fraud was not only documented from the inside, it was independently corroborated from the outside, by victims who had no reason to lie on my behalf, and every reason to want their money back. There was a young registrar at the gallery, a woman named Sophia Reyes, who had worked for us for 4 years. Meticulous and quiet in a way I recognized because it was the way I had once been at her age. Before Richard taught me the value of being loud enough to be believed. Sophia flagged, in month 6, a discrepancy in the storeroom inventory logs. A shipment listed as received that she could not locate a corresponding condition report for, and she brought it to me directly rather than to Richard, which I have thought about often since, because I think some instinct in her recognized, even then, which one of us was actually running the operation underneath its own paperwork. I told her I would look into it personally, and I did, and I thanked her, and I asked her, gently, to bring any future discrepancies to me first, rather than logging them in the shared system, framing it as a request to keep minor administrative confusion from unsettling the board unnecessarily during a busy season. She agreed without question, because I had earned 4 years of her trust by then. And I have felt, more than once since, a complicated guilt about using that trust to keep her quiet for 5 more months, even though I know, rationally, that bringing her fully into what I was building would have put her career and her safety at genuine risk if anything had gone wrong before the case was ready. When the arrests happened, Sophia was one of the first people to call me, not to ask what had happened, but simply to say she was glad I was safe. And I understood then that she had likely suspected far more than she had ever said aloud, and had chosen, in her own quiet way, to trust me the same way I had once had to learn to trust myself. The auction was scheduled for the 2nd week of December, the culmination of the gallery's year. 300 of the wealthiest collectors in the city gathering under chandeliers, to bid on what they believed was the finest inventory Whitfield Fine Art had ever assembled. Richard had planned, I later learned from our attorney's own mouth, to use the evening as his moment. He intended to announce, gently, publicly, with exactly the right amount of sorrowful restraint, that I would be stepping back from the gallery due to health concerns. Chloe stood beside him in a black dress I recognized, my mother's, that she had taken from my closet without asking, and she looked, I will admit, radiant, and utterly certain that this was the night her sister quietly disappeared from her own life. I came to the auction anyway. I wore the darkest, simplest gown I owned, and I did not hide, and I did not perform fragility for a single second of that evening. Because there was no longer any reason to. The room that night was the room I had grown up watching my father move through. The same chandeliers, in fact, since Whitfield Fine Art had held its annual sale in the same ballroom at the plaza for the better part of 2 decades out of a kind of sentimental loyalty Richard found charming and my father had found simply correct. I knew nearly every face in that crowd of 300. I had authenticated pieces hanging in half their homes. I had sat across dinner tables, from most of them at charity functions, for a decade, and not one of them, moving through the room that night with champagne and small talk, had the faintest idea that within the hour, they would be watching federal agents lead the gallery's own principals out through the same doors the waitstaff used for the AA. I remember the specific, strange calm of that final hour. I remember thinking that my father would have recognized this feeling. The particular stillness that settles over you in the seconds before you reveal that a painting everyone in the room believes is genuine is, in fact, something else entirely. It is not nerves. By that point it is simply the last quiet moment before a fact becomes public. Richard stepped up to the podium at 8:15. He had barely begun the first sentence of the speech he had clearly rehearsed. Something about difficult seasons and a family's strength, when the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. And it was not a doctor who walked through them, and it was not our attorney. It was 6 agents from the FBI, art crime team, and 2 representatives from Interpol's Cultural Property Division, and they did not walk toward me. I had spent 4 months compiling everything. The falsified provenance records. The shipping manifests that proved the reproductions had been commissioned and knowingly sold as originals. The encrypted offshore accounts Richard had opened to hide the profits, and the internal transfer authorizations that, because Richard had structured the fraud through the gallery's corporate accounts, using Chloe as a listed signatory to keep his own name further from the paper trail, implicated her just as thoroughly as him. I submitted it all anonymously, weeks earlier, through counsel, to the federal authorities, along with an inventory of exactly what agents would find in the gallery's storeroom, if they cared to look. They cared to look. 300 of the city's most influential collectors, and 2 members of the press watched as agents read Richard and Chloe their rights beneath the chandeliers, beside the very reproductions Richard had spent years passing off as masterpieces. I remember the specific quality of the silence that fell over that ballroom in the first several seconds, before anyone quite understood what they were watching. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to mouths. A woman near the front, the wife of a hedge fund manager I had known for a decade, actually gasped audibly, and the sound seemed to travel through the crowd like something physical. One small shock passing person to person, until the entire room had absorbed it. Somewhere behind me a phone camera came up, and then another, and I understood, distantly, that within the hour this moment would exist in a form none of us could control, on screens far beyond that ballroom. And I found, to my own surprise, that I did not mind. My father had spent 40 years building a reputation on truth being visible. It seemed, in a strange way, fitting that the truth about what had happened to his legacy would become visible in exactly the same public, unmistakable way. Richard turned and found me in the crowd. He said my name like it was a question he expected me to answer correctly, the way he always had. He asked me to fix this. He actually asked me, in front of everyone, to fix it, as though 11 months of watching him plan to erase me had earned him one more rescue. I walked toward him slowly. I took a small unhurried sip from the champagne glass I was still holding, and when I was close enough that only the 2 of them could hear me, I said the only thing I had left to say to either of them. You both thought I was just a beautiful painting to hang on the wall and admire. You forgot to check who actually owns the frame. Then I stepped back, and I let the agents finish their work. There was one night, in the 8th month, when I nearly lost everything, and I think about it more than almost any other single night in that entire year, because it taught me exactly how thin the margin actually was between success and catastrophe. I had left my laptop open in the leased office, a mistake I had never once made before, and never made again, and Richard, who had begun, I later learned, quietly monitoring my phone's location data out of his own growing paranoia, tracked me there on a Tuesday I had told him I was at a late board dinner. He did not confront me. He did something worse, in a way. He waited outside on the street for 40 minutes, in the cold, watching the window, before he finally left, and he mentioned it to me 3 days later, carefully, almost casually, over dinner, framing it as concern. He said he had been worried about me working such late hours by myself, and had I considered that the stress might be part of why I had seemed so forgetful lately. I understood, in that moment, that he had followed me, and had either not found what he was looking for, or had found something and decided not to show his hand yet. I spent the following 2 days in a state of controlled terror, moving the entire physical ledger and every printed document to a second backup location Walter had insisted months earlier that I establish for exactly this contingency. A small storage unit under yet another name, accessible only by a key I kept sewn into the lining of a coat I never wore in front of either of them. I never used the leased office again after that week. I finished the remaining 3 months of the work from Walter's own conference room, arriving separately, leaving separately, taking a different route every time. I tell you this because I think it matters that you understand this was never a story about a woman who was simply cleverer than the people trying to destroy her. It was a story about a woman who was frightened, badly, more than once, and who kept working anyway. Because the alternative, letting the fear stop the work, meant letting them win by default. Tracing Richard's offshore structure was, by a wide margin, the most technically difficult part of the 11 months. And I would not have finished it without Walter quietly bringing in a forensic accountant he trusted completely. A woman named Priscilla Nakamura, who had spent a career unwinding exactly this kind of layered, corporate, concealment for federal investigations before going into private practice. She explained to me, patiently, over several sessions, how Richard had structured 3 shell entities across 2 jurisdictions, each one owning a piece of the next, so that the actual beneficiary of the fraudulent sales was buried under enough corporate layers that a casual observer, or a distracted wife, would never think to look past the first one. It took Priscilla and me 11 weeks to trace the full structure back to a single numbered account in a jurisdiction that, until relatively recently, would have made that account essentially untouchable by American authorities. What made it touchable, in the end, was not cleverness on our part but a treaty update Priscilla happened to know about. One that had quietly closed exactly the kind of loophole Richard's structure depended on, 2 years before he ever built it. He had, in other words, built his entire concealment strategy on a door that had already been closed, and simply never checked. I remember the night Priscilla finally showed me the completed trail. Every transfer, every shell entity, every dollar's actual path, from an unsuspecting collector's bank account to Richard's numbered account, and back out again into the townhouse renovations and the vacation properties I had, until that night, believed we owned honestly together. I did not cry that night either. I have found, over these 2 years, that I saved almost all of my crying for very specific, private moments, usually alone, usually much later than the moment that actually caused it. And I think that delay, that discipline, is probably the single skill that got me through the entire 11 months intact. People have asked me, since the story became public, why I did not simply leave the moment I found the hotel receipt, pack a bag, hire a divorce attorney, walk away with whatever the courts allotted me, and let the rest of it go. I understand the question. I even understand the appeal of the answer. It assumes a version of me who protects her own peace first, and lets the consequences fall where they may. I did not choose that version because leaving quietly would have meant leaving the 7 collectors defrauded, the widow doubting her own good judgment, the registrar's honest flagged discrepancy, buried forever, and my father's actual name permanently, silently attached to a fraud he never would have tolerated for a single day of his 40 years in this business. Leaving would have protected me, it would not have protected the truth. I decided, somewhere in that walk-in closet holding a hotel receipt, that I was no longer willing to be the only person in this story who ended up protected. I think it is worth explaining, plainly, how Richard's scheme actually worked, because the elegance of it, and I use that word only in the technical sense, is part of why it went undetected inside my own gallery, for as long as it did. Richard had, over roughly 6 years, commissioned an extraordinarily skilled reproduction painter, working out of a studio in Queens, a man who, as far as the eventual investigation could determine, genuinely did not know the finished works were being sold as originals, rather than as the high-end decorative reproductions. He believed he had been hired to produce. Richard would acquire a genuine minor work through legitimate channels. Quietly, have it reproduced at a level of technical skill that could pass a cursory inspection. And then sell the reproduction to a private client, as the authenticated original. While the actual original either remained in his own private holdings, or was resold separately through a second, unrelated channel entirely, effectively allowing him to monetize a single painting twice. The scheme depended entirely on one thing: which was that clients trusted the Whitfield name enough not to request an independent third-party authentication. Because the entire point of coming to us was that my authentication was supposed to be the independent, trustworthy word. Richard was, in effect, laundering his own fraud through my 17 years of professional credibility, a fact that, once I fully understood it, made the 11 months of quiet, patient documentation feel less like revenge, and more like an obligation I owed to every honest client who had ever trusted my name. 3 of the 7 collectors Walter and I eventually reached, a couple from Connecticut, who had purchased what they believed was a minor but genuine 19th-century landscape, a private equity investor who had purchased 2 pieces for a corporate collection, and an elderly widow on the Upper West Side who had purchased a small drawing as a memorial piece after her husband's death, had each independently commissioned their own conservators for minor restoration work in the preceding 2 years. And each conservator had noted, quietly, in private restoration reports never shared with the gallery, materials and techniques inconsistent with the claimed period. None of them had known what to do with that information. None of them had wanted to accuse a gallery as respected as ours, without proof. I gave them, gently, through Walter, the proof they needed, and in exchange they gave the eventual case something I could never have manufactured on my own: unimpeachable, independent, external corroboration. What people do not see in the version of this story that made the papers is what came after the chandeliers and the handcuffs, which was, for me, in many ways harder than the 11 months that came before it. Because the 11 months before had a plan and a purpose, and the months after had only paperwork and silence. There were federal investigators in my life, for the better part of 8 months. Agent Marcos Delgado, who led the ARC crime team's side of the case, sat across from me in a conference room downtown more times than I can count, walking through every document in the file I had compiled, verifying it independently against the gallery's actual records, the shipping company's actual manifests, the offshore bank's own compliance disclosures once subpoenas forced them open. He told me, near the end of it, that in 15 years doing this work he had rarely seen a private citizen's own documentation hold up so completely under independent verification. He said it was the difference between somebody who was angry and somebody who was precise. I told him precision was the only inheritance I had ever fully trusted. The grand jury proceedings took 4 months to conclude. I testified twice, once for 2 full days, walking prosecutors through provenance records the way I had once walked disputed canvases through authentication for museums. Sentence by sentence, document by document, refusing to let a single claim stand on anything less than paper. Richard's attorneys tried, predictably, to characterize me as a bitter, vindictive wife, who had fabricated a narrative out of an affair. It did not work, because a bitter, vindictive narrative does not include shipping manifests with matching dates, matching signatures, and matching bank routing numbers. Chloe's attorneys tried a gentler argument, that she had been manipulated by Richard and had not understood what she was signing. The transfer authorizations, each one requiring her to initial a line-item description of exactly what asset was moving and where, made that argument considerably harder to sustain than her attorneys had hoped. I sat in that courtroom the way I imagined my father would have sat in it, if he had lived to see what became of the name he built. Quiet, attentive, not performing grief, and not performing triumph, because neither one would have changed a single fact already sitting in the record. I listened to 11 months of my own careful, unglamorous work, read into evidence, line by line, and I understood, somewhere around the 3rd week of testimony, that this was the actual ending my father had prepared me for, on that Saturday morning decades earlier, standing me in front of a painting, and asking me to tell him, honestly, precisely, what I actually saw. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case, a woman named Angela Restrepo, told me near the end of it that the hardest part of her job in white-collar fraud cases is usually assembling a timeline precise enough to survive cross-examination, and that in 17 years of practice, she had never once had a private citizen hand her one this complete. She used my ledger, cross-verified against every independent record her own investigators could locate, as the literal spine of the government's case, walking the jury through it week by week, month by month. The way I imagine a conservator walks a client through the layers of a restoration, showing them, patiently, exactly what lay beneath the surface everyone had assumed was simply the whole painting. The widow from the Upper West Side testified on the 6th day. She was 79 years old and she spoke for 11 minutes about a small drawing she had purchased to remember her husband by, and about how it had taken her 2 years to admit to herself that something about it felt wrong, and about how grateful she was that someone had finally believed her instead of telling her she was imagining things. I watched 3 members of the jury write something down when she finished speaking. I did not need to see what they wrote to understand what it meant. Richard did not testify in his own defense. His attorneys, I later learned, advised strongly against it, understanding correctly that no version of his account could survive contact with the documentation already in evidence. Chloe did testify, on the 9th day, and she cried. And she said she had loved Richard, and had not fully understood what she was signing. And I believed, watching her, that some part of that was probably true, and that it did not change a single fact about what her signature had actually authorized. I think often about what it must have looked like from the jury box, watching 11 months of my life reduced to exhibits with numbers on them, watching a marriage and a sisterhood dismantled into spreadsheets, and shipping manifests and sworn statements. I imagine it must have felt, to them, almost clinical, almost bloodless. The way a surgery looks clinical to anyone standing outside the sterile field, unaware of everything underneath the steady, careful hands. Angela Restrepo told me afterward that one juror, an accountant himself, had stayed behind after the verdict was read simply to tell the court officer that he had rarely seen a case built with this much internal consistency. Every document supporting every other document, without a single contradiction across 11 months of transactions. I did not build it that way to impress a jury. I built it that way because my father taught me that sloppy work eventually fails, no matter how good the intentions behind it. And I was not willing to let 11 months of careful, exhausting effort collapse over a single inconsistency I could have caught with more patience. The jury deliberated for a day and a half, which Walter told me was, if anything, faster than he had expected, given the volume of financial documentation they had to work through. I spent that day and a half in my Geneva office, not because I did not want to be present for the verdict, but because Walter had gently suggested that a wife sitting anxiously in the gallery of a federal courthouse, waiting to learn her husband's fate, would make a certain kind of headline. And a woman quietly working from her own foundation's office, unbothered, would make a very different one. And he was, as he so often was, entirely correct about which version served the truth better. The call came at 4:40 in the afternoon, Geneva time. Guilty on all 11 counts against Richard. Guilty on 4 of the 7 counts against Chloe, the jury having apparently found enough ambiguity in her state of knowledge on the remaining 3 to decline conviction there, which Walter told me was, if anything, evidence of how carefully and fairly the jury had actually done its job, rather than any failure of the case itself. I did not celebrate. I want to be honest about that, because I think it is the truest thing I can tell you about how this actually feels once it finally arrives. I sat at my desk for a long moment after Walter's call ended, looking out at the lake, and what I felt was not triumph. It was something closer to the specific. Quiet stillness, I imagine, settles over a conservator when a difficult restoration is finally, fully complete, and the painting underneath the damage is, at last, simply visible for exactly what it always was. Richard is facing federal fraud charges that carry, according to our attorney, a minimum of 12 years, and Chloe, despite everything, despite the years I spent raising her, is facing her own charges as a knowing signatory on the accounts that laundered Richard's fraud. I have not spoken to her since that night. I do not know, yet, if I ever will. Grief and clarity, it turns out, can also both be true at once. The gallery itself did not survive the scandal. Whitfield Fine Art filed for dissolution within 6 weeks. Its name now permanently attached to one of the larger authentication fraud cases the art world has seen in a decade. I felt very little about that. It was Richard's name on the door. It was never really mine. The 7 collectors who had unknowingly purchased reproductions were, eventually, made financially whole through a restitution order tied to the sentencing, funded in part through the liquidation of assets traced back to Richard's offshore accounts. A process Priscilla oversaw with the same patient precision she had brought to finding the money in the first place. The widow from the Upper West Side sent me a card afterward, handwritten, thanking me for believing her, when she had struggled for 2 years to believe herself. I keep that card in the same desk drawer in Geneva, where I keep the last photograph I have of my father. Standing in front of a painting, mid-sentence, teaching me something I did not yet know I would need. What is mine is the collection, every real piece of it, sitting safely inside the foundation my father built, and I now run from a quiet office in Geneva, in a building with my name on the registry, and no one else's. What is mine is a life I am building for the first time entirely on my own terms, in a city where nobody yet knows the story, where I am simply the woman with the extraordinary eye, and nothing else they need to be told. I think about the stone I felt at that first hotel receipt, the one I never let myself react to out loud. I was right about that stone. I want you to know that, the way I know it myself now, completely. Being right about people who are hurting you does not make the 11 months easier to look back on. It does not give me back the sister I raised. But it gave me something else. It gave me the truth, finally spoken out loud, in a ballroom full of the people who had once decided my husband's version of me was the only one worth believing. There was one conversation, about 4 months after the verdict, that I had not expected, and still think about often. A woman named Diane Forsyth, who had been one of the loudest voices among our old social circle in the early days of the scandal. The kind of woman who had said, at more than one dinner party, before the truth came out, that she always thought there was something a little cold about Clara. Poor Richard showed up unannounced at a small exhibition I was hosting at a private gallery in Zurich. She found me near the wine table, and she said, without much preamble, that she owed me an apology. She said she had believed the version of the story Richard told at parties, long before any of it became public, because it was easier and more comfortable than considering the alternative, and she said she was sorry for that. And she said it plainly, without asking for reassurance in return. I told her I appreciated her saying so. I did not tell her it did not matter, because it did matter. A little the way small late acknowledgments of a larger unfairness always matter a little without ever being quite enough. She nodded, and she did not linger. And she left, and I thought, watching her go, about how much of this entire story had depended on people's willingness to believe the louder, more comfortable version of events over the quieter, more difficult one. And how rarely anyone stops to ask whether the quiet version might actually be the true one. The art world, unlike a small town, does not process a scandal slowly or quietly. It processes it in whispers at every opening for a year. In 100 small conversations at auctions, I no longer needed to attend. In journalists calling my Geneva office for a comment I never gave. ArtNet ran 3 separate pieces on the collapse of Whitfield Fine Art. A reporter from the Times found her way to my father's old framing shop off Madison Avenue, and wrote a paragraph about how the business Edmund Whitfield built from nothing had, in the end, survived his death by exactly as long as it took his son-in-law's greed to catch up with it, and outlived it anyway, in me. Some colleagues reached out with real warmth. A curator I had known for 15 years, a woman named Priya Anand, at a major museum, called me the week the story broke, and said only, "I always thought you were the one actually running that gallery. I am glad the rest of the world finally knows it too." Others were quieter, uncertain how to address a woman who had just publicly dismantled her own husband, as though sympathy and admiration could not occupy the same sentence, when in my experience, they very often do. I do not know if I will ever speak to Chloe again. I have turned that door over in my mind many times, in the 2 years since, and I have not yet found a version of opening it that does not also reopen everything else. Perhaps someday, grief, I have learned, does not resolve on the timeline you would choose for it. It simply becomes something you carry differently over time, lighter in some seasons, heavier in others, but never entirely set down. My days now look almost nothing like the ones I lived for the 11 years of my marriage. I wake early in an apartment overlooking Lake Geneva that belongs entirely to me. No one else's name on any document attached to it. I run the foundation my father built with the same patient, careful attention he taught me on those Saturday mornings decades ago. Evaluating acquisitions, overseeing loans to museums that finally, rightly, credit the collection under the Whitfield name, in a way that means my father's actual legacy, rather than the diminished, borrowed version of it Richard spent a decade constructing. I have taken on 3 young authenticators as apprentices. 2 women, and 1 man. And I stand them in front of paintings on quiet mornings, and ask them to tell me what they see before I tell them what they are looking at. And some mornings, doing that, I feel my father so clearly in the room, that it is less like missing him, and more like continuing him. I still think, more often than I expected to, about the version of myself who stood in that walk-in closet holding a hotel receipt, 22 months ago now, deciding in the space of about 4 minutes not to scream. I do not think that decision made me cold, though I know it read that way to people watching the story unfold from the outside. I think it made me, finally, entirely accurate about my own worth, in the same specific, unforgiving way I have always been accurate about a canvas. A painting is either what it claims to be, or it is not. I spent 35 years being generous about the difference in my own life, in ways I was never once generous about in my professional one. And I do not intend to make that particular error again. What I hope, if anyone watching this ever finds themselves standing where I once stood, noticing a stone settle wrong in their own chest, and not yet able to name why, is that they trusted sooner than I let myself trust mine. I hope they understand that being loved by people and being endangered by people are not, unfortunately, mutually exclusive states, and that the instinct telling you something is wrong is very rarely wrong about the wrongness itself, even when it takes months to understand the shape of it. My name is Clara Whitfield. I am the daughter of Edmund and Margaret Whitfield. I was taught, on quiet Saturday mornings, in front of paintings I did not yet understand, to look closely at things, and to trust exactly what I saw there, even when it was inconvenient, even when it cost me people I loved. I built an empire with my eye and my patience, and when the people closest to me decided I was something to be quietly removed from my own life, I removed them from theirs instead. I sometimes imagine my father standing in the doorway of the Geneva office, the way he used to stand in the doorway of his own study, watching me work without interrupting, and I imagine him saying nothing at all, because he was never a man who needed to say a thing twice, once it had already been proven true. He taught me to look closely. He taught me that a thing either holds up under close examination, or it does not. Everything I did in those 11 months was simply that lesson, applied, finally, to my own life instead of someone else's canvas. I do not know what the next chapter of my life looks like yet, and for the first time in a very long time, I find that I do not need to know. I spent 35 years being extraordinarily good at seeing exactly what other people's paintings actually were. I am only now learning to turn that same unflinching attention on my own life, on what is actually true in it, on what deserves to stay, and what never should have been hung on the wall in the first place. It is slower work than I expected. It is also, unexpectedly, the first work in a very long time that belongs entirely, completely, only to me. That is the whole story. That is everything. Thank you for staying with it, all the way to the end.